Sure, here's a suggested introduction for your video story. In a busy hospital ward, the quiet hum of medical equipment and soft murmurs of staff filled the air, but the atmosphere was far from calm. It was just another day on the job for Nurse Carla, a dedicated professional who had seen it all. But today, she was about to face something far worse than the usual pressures of her work, something that would test her patience and composure in a way she never expected. As Carla prepared for her next patient, she had no idea that she was about to encounter a man who would challenge not only her skills but her dignity. The patient, a middle-aged man named Mr. Williams, was waiting in the room, looking anxious but polite. Little did he know, the situation unfolding outside his door was about to spiral into something that would leave him questioning the professionalism of the people around him. Dr. Hughes, a senior physician with a reputation for being outspoken and, at times, abrasive, entered the scene. His confidence was usually unshakable, but today, something about the way he spoke to Carla struck a nerve. His words, dismissive and belittling, cut through the air as he took charge of the case. He didn't hold back, making rude remarks about her methods and casting doubt on her competence. The tension was palpable as he overshadowed her with his authority, never once pausing to consider her expertise or experience. What Dr. Hughes didn't know was that Mr. Williams, the patient he was so quick to impress with his apparent superiority, wasn't just any ordinary person. Mr. Williams, sitting quietly in his chair, was no stranger to the world of medicine and had a unique connection to healthcare that no one could have predicted. He had seen more than his fair share of doctors, nurses, and hospital staff, and he knew what it meant to be treated with respect. But as he overheard Dr. Hughes' cruel words, something inside him began to stir. He had never been one to stand by when injustice was happening right in front of him. The nurse, caught in the middle of this uncomfortable interaction, stood there, trying her best to maintain her composure. But the humiliation was real. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the frustration of being belittled in front of a patient, one she had worked tirelessly to care for. And yet, as Dr. Hughes continued his tirade, something changed in the air. The temperature seemed to drop, and the room felt heavier. Mr. Williams, who had been silently observing the scene, suddenly spoke up. His voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that made both Carla and Dr. Hughes pause. "I think we need to reassess the situation here," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes, taken aback, seemed to brush it off at first, thinking nothing of the remark. But as he turned to face Mr. Williams, he felt an unease that he couldn't quite place. There was something about the man in the chair that didn't add up, something about the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice that made him pause. And just as quickly as the tension had risen, it was shattered by a phone call that would change everything. The moment Dr. Hughes picked up the receiver, his face drained of color, his expression unreadable. The conversation was short, but it was enough to make him break a cold sweat. Carla watched the exchange, wondering what could possibly be going on. Mr. Williams, still calm, turned his gaze to her, as though silently asking if she knew what was happening. Her mind raced, but she could only guess at the mystery unfolding. As Dr. Hughes hung up the phone, his demeanor shifted in an instant. The brash, condescending doctor was gone, replaced by someone different. The man who had once dismissed Carla now seemed almost apologetic, his words fumbling as he addressed the room. But the damage had already been done. The tension lingered, and it was clear that something far more significant was at play. What no one knew was that Mr. Williams wasn't just another patient. He wasn't just someone to be treated and dismissed. His identity, hidden beneath layers of privacy, was about to be revealed in a way no one could have predicted. And when the truth came to light, the consequences for Dr. Hughes and those involved would be far greater than they could have imagined. The question was, how far would they all go to right the wrongs that had just been set into motion? To be continued. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments to this script. The phone call had ended, but the silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Hughes stood there, holding the receiver in his hand like it was a foreign object, his mind racing. It had been a routine call. At least that's what he thought at first. But now, with the way his heart was pounding in his chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He was no longer the confident, well-respected doctor who commanded attention. Now he was just a man caught off guard, fumbling in the aftermath of an encounter he hadn't expected. Carla, still standing in the corner of the room, watched him carefully, her instincts telling her that whatever had just transpired on that call was something far more serious than a simple update about a patient's condition. She had always prided herself on being able to read people, to understand when things were off. And right now, everything felt off. Dr. Hughes was not himself. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, as if something was about to break. Mr. Williams, still sitting in the chair with an air of quiet authority, had observed the entire exchange in silence. His sharp eyes never left Dr. Hughes as the physician stood there, seemingly lost in thought. Mr. Williams hadn't said much since his initial comment, but his presence was undeniable. There was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself, in the way he seemed to be both observing and waiting for something. It was as if he had known exactly how this moment would unfold. Carla couldn't help but feel an odd sense of unease as she looked at Mr. Williams. There was something about him that was unsettling. She had met many patients in her years of service, some anxious, some agitated, some in pain. But there was a certain calm about Mr. Williams that was almost too composed, too deliberate. His eyes were sharp, watching everything with a level of awareness that felt almost practiced. Like he had been in situations like this before, only he wasn't the one who was in trouble. She had been a nurse for years, had worked alongside countless doctors, some of whom were kind, others more gruff, but she had never seen anything quite like this. Dr. Hughes, despite his arrogance and blunt manner, was usually professional, at least when it came to his patients. But this time, something had triggered a reaction in him that was beyond the usual condescension. His tone, his words, everything had felt different. There had been whispers among the staff about Dr. Hughes' reputation, but none of it had prepared Carla for what she had witnessed today. The way he had spoken to her, in front of a patient no less, had been deeply humiliating. It wasn't just a matter of professional rivalry or criticism. It had been a personal attack, designed to strip her of her confidence and leave her questioning her place in the room. But what bothered Carla more than anything was the strange shift that had occurred after the phone call. She could feel the change in the air, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees, and a quiet tension had settled into the room. It was as though Dr. Hughes was trying to regain some control, but his efforts seemed futile. He kept glancing at Mr. Williams, as though expecting something, an answer, maybe, or some sign that this encounter wasn't going to escalate further. For a moment, the doctor cleared his throat and tried to regain his composure. He was back to being the authoritative figure, the man who called the shots in the hospital. He looked at Carla and then at Mr. Williams, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I apologize for the earlier misunderstanding," he said, his voice now forced and tight. "I was simply trying to ensure the best possible care for you, Mr. Williams." But Mr. Williams did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied Dr. Hughes with a level of scrutiny that made the doctor uneasy. There was no warmth in the man's gaze, no acknowledgement of the apology, just silence. It wasn't the silence of someone who was stunned into inaction, but the silence of someone who was calculating, evaluating. "I see," Mr. Williams said after a long pause, his voice steady, yet tinged with a quiet authority. "But I wonder, Dr. Hughes, if you have ever considered that your actions might not be about providing the best care at all, but rather about something else entirely." Dr. Hughes stiffened. The words cut through the air like a blade. He had expected some kind of polite acknowledgement, some sign that the situation was under control. But now Mr. Williams was challenging him, challenging the very foundation of his approach to medicine. It wasn't just about the doctor-patient relationship anymore. It was something deeper, something that threatened to unravel the narrative Dr. Hughes had spent years building. "Excuse me," Dr. Hughes managed to say, his voice a little shaky. Mr. Williams leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in his lap as though he were in no rush. "You see, doctor," he began, his tone still calm, but carrying a weight that made the doctor's stomach tighten. "I spent a great deal of time in hospitals. Not as a patient, mind you, but as someone who has seen the inner workings of the medical field from a different perspective. From a perspective that most people would never imagine." Carla could feel her heart race as the tension in the room continued to build. What was Mr. Williams talking about? What perspective was he referring to? She had heard the whispers before, the rumors about patients being more than they seemed, but she had never imagined that she would witness something like this in real time. Dr. Hughes, now visibly rattled, tried to cover his unease with a forced chuckle. "I'm sure you've had your share of medical experiences, Mr. Williams, but I assure you, we have protocols in place to ensure the highest standards of care." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Mr. Williams responded, his voice taking on a hint of irony. "But the question is, who really benefits from those protocols, doctor? Is it the patients, or is it the doctors who follow them, who build their careers upon them?" Dr. Hughes was beginning to sweat. His earlier bravado was quickly slipping away as Mr. Williams pressed further. Carla could see the shift in him, the way his confidence had begun to crumble under the weight of Mr. Williams' words. He had thought he could control this situation, but now it seemed as if the tables were turning. But just as the tension reached its peak, there was a knock at the door. Carla's pulse quickened. Who could it be now? She couldn't help but wonder if something, or someone, was about to tip the balance in a way none of them could anticipate. Dr. Hughes turned sharply, trying to compose himself. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to see him faltering. He quickly straightened his white coat, wiped his hands on his pants, and nodded toward the door. "Come in," he called, his voice back to its usual stern tone, though the edge of uncertainty lingered beneath. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was a nurse with a clipboard. She looked at the scene before her, Carla standing off to the side, Dr. Hughes looking disoriented, and Mr. Williams sitting silently as ever. And for a brief moment, no one spoke. Carla's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The nurse in the doorway hesitated for a moment, as though sensing the change in the atmosphere. Her eyes darted between Dr. Hughes, Mr. Williams, and Carla. She quickly glanced at the clipboard in her hand, but there was no mistaking the tension that filled the room. It was palpable, like the air just before a storm. "Dr. Hughes," the nurse said carefully, her voice tentative, "we have an issue with one of the test results for Mr. Williams. The lab just sent over an update." Her words hung in the air like a faint echo, adding to the unease that had settled over the room. Dr. Hughes, his expression stiff, glanced at Mr. Williams, then at the nurse. For a brief moment, he seemed torn between handling the situation at hand and dealing with whatever new complication had arisen. His fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, as though he were trying to regain some semblance of control. "Give me the update," he said sharply, his voice now cold, almost mechanical, like a man who had learned to hide his cracks behind a facade of professionalism. His earlier uncertainty was quickly buried beneath the layers of authority he was trying so desperately to maintain. But no matter how hard he tried to cling to his control, the cracks were still there, visible to anyone who was paying attention. The nurse stepped into the room, handing him the clipboard. Dr. Hughes glanced at the paper, his face unreadable. His eyes flicked back and forth across the text, his mind processing the information. Then something about the results made his breath catch. His gaze shifted to the nurse, confusion flickering across his features. "Are you sure this is accurate?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. The nurse nodded, her face taut with worry. "Yes, Dr. Hughes. The lab confirmed it twice. It's unexpected." Dr. Hughes pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to process the new information. It didn't make sense. The test results, what they indicated, seemed almost impossible. A sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach, and for a moment, he forgot about the man sitting quietly in the corner, watching the entire exchange with a calm that sent a chill through the room. Carla's curiosity was piqued. She couldn't make out the words on the paper, but the tension between Dr. Hughes and the nurse was growing. She could sense that whatever was going on now was connected to the odd dynamic she had witnessed earlier. Something bigger was at play, something that was making Dr. Hughes uneasy, something that went beyond his usual arrogance. Mr. Williams, still sitting silently, seemed to be aware of the situation, his eyes narrowing slightly as he continued to observe the unfolding drama. There was no outward sign of concern or alarm in his demeanor. In fact, his silence seemed more telling than any words he could have spoken. He was waiting for something. Carla could feel it, a palpable sense that he was no ordinary patient. Dr. Hughes stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the clipboard. He slowly set it down on the table and cleared his throat. "Carla," he said abruptly, breaking the silence with an unexpected sharpness, "can you check on the status of the other patients in the ward? I'll need you to assist me with something shortly." Carla nodded, though her mind was still racing. The tension in the room felt like it was about to snap, and she wasn't sure what to do next. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, but her thoughts were consumed by the strange undercurrent of what was happening. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had witnessed today had been part of something much larger than a simple hospital visit. There was a bigger story here, one that involved power, manipulation, and secrets no one was willing to admit. Outside in the hallway, the hospital was as bustling as usual, nurses moving quickly between rooms, doctors reviewing charts, the hum of medical equipment in every corner. But Carla's mind wasn't on the tasks ahead. Her thoughts kept returning to Mr. Williams, to the way he had quietly observed everything, to the way Dr. Hughes had reacted to him. It wasn't normal. It wasn't how things should be. She had been a nurse long enough to know that. She stopped at the nurse's station, trying to gather her thoughts. Her colleagues were too busy with their own tasks to notice her agitation. But Carla couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something big, something dangerous. She knew that, somehow, Mr. Williams was at the heart of it all, though she couldn't yet understand why. Meanwhile, inside the patient's room, Dr. Hughes was pacing. His mind was no longer on the test results alone. He was thinking of something else, something hidden beneath the layers of hospital protocol and medical jargon. A connection that went back years. His mind flickered through the files in his memory, but every lead he thought of seemed to slip away, like sand through his fingers. Mr. Williams, still silent, seemed to sense the doctor's internal struggle. He stood up from the chair, slowly, deliberately, as if he were about to reveal something that would shatter the fragile calm that had surrounded them. "You're not the only one with secrets, Dr. Hughes," Mr. Williams said, his voice smooth, almost serene. "And I believe it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." Dr. Hughes froze. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. He hadn't anticipated this. He had thought he could control the situation, but now it seemed as though the tables were turning, and Mr. Williams was about to reveal something that could bring everything crashing down. Mr. Williams took a step forward, his presence commanding attention. The doctor's face went pale, and Carla, who had been standing just outside the door, could hear the change in the tone of the conversation. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to make sense of what was being said, but she couldn't quite catch the words. What was going on? What was Mr. Williams going to reveal? The door opened suddenly, and Carla stepped back, startled. She turned to see Dr. Hughes emerge, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. He didn't look like the confident doctor who had entered the room moments ago. He looked vulnerable. "I'll need a moment," he muttered, his voice strained. He didn't meet Carla's eyes as he passed by her. She watched him leave, her curiosity now piqued beyond measure. She had no idea what had just transpired in that room, but she knew it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And Mr. Williams? She couldn't help but wonder what he had been holding back. What he knew, and how it was all tied to Dr. Hughes. One thing was certain, this story was far from over. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and someone was about to put them all together. But who? And at what cost? The tension in the hospital was thick, like the calm before a storm. Carla stood there for a moment, staring after Dr. Hughes, unsure of what to make of his hurried exit. Her mind was racing, thoughts colliding with one another. The tension in the room was unbearable, and the more she tried to piece it together, the more she realized that there were things going on beneath the surface, things she wasn't fully aware of yet. But one thing was clear. Something was about to break wide open. She had never seen Dr. Hughes like this. He had always been arrogant, yes, even dismissive at times, but there had always been a certain confidence about him. Now that was gone, replaced with a quiet panic she hadn't known he was capable of. And it was clear that whatever had just happened in that room, it wasn't something he was prepared for. Carla couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself. She glanced over at the nurses' station again, her mind spinning. Her colleagues were still oblivious to the growing storm. The world around her moved in its usual rhythm, but it felt distant, like she was on the outside looking in. The walls seemed to close in as she wondered what the next steps would be. She had to know more. She needed answers. Her eyes darted back toward Mr. Williams' room, the one where everything had started to unravel. She had been the one to call the shots in that room for so long, but now it felt as if she had no control over anything. The very foundation of her world, her career, was being shaken. She needed to find a way to make sense of it all. In the silence of the hallway, Carla's thoughts shifted to the mysterious patient who had turned everything upside down. Mr. Williams had remained calm throughout, a strange tranquility in his demeanor. But now, as the moments passed, she began to feel an unease settle within her chest. It was as though the quiet moments had all been a setup, a prelude to something much more dramatic. And with each passing second, the feeling that something was imminent grew stronger. She couldn't just walk away. She had to know what Mr. Williams had planned. Suddenly, a sound broke her from her thoughts, a door creaking open. Carla turned, only to see a figure standing at the end of the hall, just beyond the nurse's station. It was Dr. Hughes. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man Carla didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit, looking very out of place in a hospital. The man had an air of authority about him, but more importantly, there was something unsettling in the way Dr. Hughes spoke to him. Carla couldn't hear the words from this distance, but the tone in Dr. Hughes' voice was urgent, desperate even. She instinctively moved closer, trying to make herself inconspicuous as she leaned against the wall. She strained her ears, trying to catch snippets of their conversation, but the words were muffled by the distance. The man in the suit said something, his voice low but firm, and Dr. Hughes nodded quickly, his face drawn and pale. Carla felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about this encounter that didn't sit right with her. She knew Dr. Hughes had connections. After all, he was a senior doctor in a prestigious hospital. But this was different. This wasn't about medicine anymore. This was about something much darker. Her curiosity got the better of her. She moved closer, her heart pounding in her chest, as she tried to stay hidden in the shadows. She could just make out the man in the suit saying something about the plan and the next step. Dr. Hughes seemed agitated, nodding in agreement, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. He wasn't the calm, collected doctor she was used to seeing. He was vulnerable now, scared even. The conversation ended abruptly when the man in the suit turned and walked away, disappearing down the corridor. Dr. Hughes stood there for a moment, staring after him, before he quickly retreated into his office. Carla's heart was racing. What had just happened? And why was Dr. Hughes so shaken? She had always known there was something off about him. But this was something entirely different. It wasn't just arrogance or a bad attitude. This was fear. She took a deep breath and slowly made her way back to Mr. Williams' room. Her mind was spinning, but one thing was certain. She couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Whatever secrets Dr. Hughes was hiding, whatever connections he had, they were coming to light now. And the more Carla uncovered, the more she realized she was tangled up in something she might not be able to escape. Inside the room, Mr. Williams was still sitting silently. His eyes followed her as she entered, but he didn't speak. His calmness was both reassuring and unnerving at the same time. Carla felt the weight of his gaze, but she didn't know if he was watching her out of curiosity or something else, something darker. She couldn't stand the silence anymore. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her words were laced with frustration and fear. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Mr. Williams looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing her question. "You really want to know?" he asked quietly. Carla nodded, her throat dry. "I need to know. This isn't just about medicine. This is something else. What is Dr. Hughes involved in?" Mr. Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Hughes is involved in much more than you think, nurse," he said slowly. "But you're not ready for the truth. You've been too close to it already." Carla's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? I deserve to know." Mr. Williams sighed deeply, as though the weight of his words was heavy. "You do, but it's not that simple. There are forces at play here, forces that have been in motion for years. Dr. Hughes is just a small piece of the puzzle, a piece you might not want to find." The words hit Carla like a punch to the gut. She had thought she was just witnessing a personal conflict between Dr. Hughes and Mr. Williams, but now she realized that this was far bigger than she had imagined. This was about power, corruption, secrets that reached far beyond this hospital. Mr. Williams stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "You need to decide, nurse. Do you want to continue playing the game, or do you want to walk away? Because once you step further into this, there's no going back." Carla's mind was spinning, the weight of his words sinking in. Her instincts told her to walk away, to forget everything and go back to her normal life. But another part of her, the part that had always pushed her to do what was right, refused to let her walk away. The tension in the room was suffocating, and she knew, deep down, that she couldn't just leave. Not now. As she looked at Mr. Williams, something in his expression shifted. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make her feel as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to take the leap. And then, just as suddenly, the door opened again. It was Dr. Hughes. But this time, he wasn't alone. The man in the suit from earlier had returned. And Carla's heart sank. She realized with a sinking certainty that this was the moment everything would change. The door swung open with a quiet creak, and Carla's breath caught in her throat as Dr. Hughes and the man in the suit entered the room. The energy in the space shifted immediately. The air was thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Dr. Hughes' usual bravado was gone, replaced with an almost desperate look in his eyes. His hands fidgeted at his sides, the stern, confident figure she had seen earlier now reduced to something far more vulnerable. The man in the suit was tall, his dark eyes scanning the room with a calculated coldness that made Carla feel as though she were under a microscope. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The air seemed to become heavier the moment the door shut, as if the room had just been sealed off from the rest of the world. Mr. Williams, still sitting calmly in his chair, didn't react to the new arrivals. But Carla noticed the faint shift in his posture, the way his body subtly tensed as the man in the suit crossed the threshold. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Dr. Hughes, who seemed momentarily flustered under the man's gaze. "What is this?" Carla managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the confusion and rising panic inside her. She wasn't sure whether she was speaking to Dr. Hughes or to the stranger, but the question seemed to hang in the air, unspoken for too long. The man in the suit didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned his gaze to Carla, studying her with the same unnerving intensity. His lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smirk. "You should be careful who you trust," he said, his voice smooth, but the undertone was chilling. "This goes deeper than you think." Carla's stomach dropped. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she didn't fully understand what he meant. She glanced at Dr. Hughes, but his face had turned pale, more pale than usual, if that was even possible. He didn't look like the same person. He looked scared. Carla's eyes flicked back to Mr. Williams, who was still eerily calm, watching the interaction unfold with an intensity that almost made her feel like a pawn in a much larger game. The man in the suit stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the floor with each step. "You're asking the wrong questions, nurse," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't about your curiosity or your concern for the patients. This is about power. And power, as you'll soon understand, has its cost." Carla felt a shiver run down her spine. What was he talking about? Power? She had thought Dr. Hughes was just a bad doctor, someone who could be a little too arrogant for his own good. But now it seemed like everything she thought she knew was wrong. And something told her that if she didn't figure it out soon, she would be pulled into a web far too complex to escape from. Before Carla could respond, Dr. Hughes finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to be careful." "We." He stopped abruptly, glancing toward the man in the suit, almost as if seeking permission to speak. The man's cold smile didn't falter. "Careful? Dr. Hughes, you're already too deep into this to worry about being careful now," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "You should have thought about that before you made your choices." Dr. Hughes swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. It was the first time she had seen him truly falter. Carla's mind raced, trying to make sense of the words that were being thrown around, but everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. Mr. Williams finally broke his silence, his voice calm and deliberate. "You think you have all the pieces," he said, his eyes never leaving Dr. Hughes. "But there are more pieces. Pieces you've been ignoring for far too long." Carla turned her attention to Mr. Williams, trying to decipher his words. Was he talking about the situation at hand? Or was there something more? His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the rising tension in the room. He was in control here, and it seemed like everyone else was just reacting to him. The man in the suit chuckled softly, a low, menacing sound. "You really don't know what you're dealing with, do you?" he asked, addressing both Carla and Dr. Hughes. "This isn't just a medical matter. This isn't just about your little hospital ward and your tests. This is about something much larger, about something that has been in the works for years." Dr. Hughes' face went even paler at the man's words. It was as if he knew exactly what the man meant, and the weight of it was too much for him to bear. He swallowed again, his eyes flicking to Mr. Williams, as if searching for an explanation, but Mr. Williams merely stared back at him, unreadable. Carla's head was spinning. She had thought she had everything figured out. She had been trained to keep a level head in high-pressure situations, but now everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She had to know more. She had to understand what was happening here. "What is this?" she asked again, more forcefully this time, her voice breaking the silence. "What's really going on here?" The man in the suit turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You don't want to know, nurse. Trust me. Once you find out, there's no turning back. You'll wish you never asked." Carla's heart hammered in her chest. The warning was clear, but it only fueled her need to know the truth. She wasn't going to back down now. Not when she was so close to uncovering whatever this was. Just as she was about to speak again, a sharp sound echoed through the hall, the sound of footsteps, fast and purposeful. Carla turned toward the door, but before anyone could react, a new figure appeared, entering the room with a presence so commanding that it silenced everyone immediately. It was a woman dressed in a white lab coat, but there was something different about her. Something cold, something unsettling. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Hughes with an intensity that made his face drain of color even further. She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the group before settling on Mr. Williams. "Is this the one?" the woman asked, her voice low and smooth, almost predatory. Mr. Williams didn't answer immediately, but Carla could see the brief flicker of recognition between the two of them. It was subtle, but it was there. The woman knew something, and now Carla was more certain than ever that she was standing in the middle of something dangerous, something far bigger than just a conflict between a doctor and a patient. "Who are you?" Carla asked, her voice trembling, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile. "Oh, I'm just the one who makes sure everything stays in order." Her gaze flicked to Dr. Hughes, who now appeared completely cornered. "And trust me, nurse," she continued, her smile widening, "things are about to get very interesting." The tension in the room snapped to its highest point. Carla could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the foreboding weight of everything that was about to unfold. This wasn't just about a hospital anymore. This was about a much deeper, more dangerous game. And now, with this new player entering the scene, Carla was starting to realize that no one was safe. Not Dr. Hughes. Not Mr. Williams. Not even her. And she was right in the middle of it all. Carla's heart was pounding as the woman in the white lab coat stepped further into the room. The tension was so thick now that she could almost feel it pressing against her chest. Every instinct told her to run, to get away from this nightmare that had been unraveling before her eyes, but she couldn't. She had to know the truth, even if it meant walking straight into the fire. The woman's gaze locked onto her with a sharp, calculating look. "You really don't understand, do you?" she asked, her voice cool and even, yet there was a hint of something menacing in her tone. "You think this is all about Dr. Hughes and Mr. Williams. You think this is just about power struggles in a hospital, but it's so much more than that." Carla took a step back, confusion flooding her. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? What's really going on here?" The woman glanced briefly at Dr. Hughes, who was still standing near the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. It was clear now that he wasn't in control of the situation, not anymore. He was just as much a pawn in this as Carla. Without taking her eyes off Carla, the woman continued, "This isn't just about medicine. It's about influence, money, power on a scale you can't even begin to comprehend." Her lips curled into a smirk, as though she were savoring the moment. "Mr. Williams isn't just a patient. He's a key player in something far larger than your little hospital. He has information, resources, things that could change everything. And you've been caught in the middle of it." Carla's mind was spinning, trying to connect the dots. Mr. Williams wasn't just a patient. But what did he have to do with this twisted web? But why would Dr. Hughes? Carla began to ask, but the woman cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Dr. Hughes, he's nothing but a tool. A small piece in a very big game. He was never meant to be the one pulling the strings. He's a means to an end, a distraction. The real game, it's far more dangerous, and it's been in motion for years." The word sent a chill down Carla's spine. She felt like she was being pulled into a world of deceit and corruption she couldn't even begin to understand. But then something clicked. Her gaze started between the man in the suit and the woman in the lab coat, and a horrifying realization began to take shape in her mind. "Mr. Williams," she whispered, her voice trembling, you're not just a patient. You're part of all this." Mr. Williams finally stood, his expression colder than ever. "You could say that," he said slowly, his eyes locking onto Carla's. "But it's not just about me. It's about everything that's been set into motion. I've been waiting for this moment for someone like you to get involved." His tone was chilling, and his words echoed in Carla's mind, ringing with an uncomfortable truth she wasn't ready to accept. "But you can't." She began to protest, but Mr. Williams raised a hand, silencing her. "You were never supposed to know," he said quietly. "But now that you do, you'll understand that there's no turning back. This isn't something you can walk away from, nurse. Not anymore." Carla's chest tightened. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a situation with no way out. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but every revelation was more disturbing than the last. This wasn't just about power struggles in a hospital. It was about a network of influence, a game of manipulation that extended far beyond what she had ever imagined. Then suddenly, it all made sense. The reason Dr. Hughes had been so desperate earlier, the strange behavior, the cryptic conversations, the way he'd avoided her questions. He had known. He had known all along that the truth would eventually come to light. And now it had. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing. It was a front, a battleground for those who sought power, and Mr. Williams had been at the center of it all. But just as the truth seemed to settle in, something unexpected happened. The door burst open once more, and this time, it wasn't just another ominous figure entering. It was the hospital director, a woman Carla recognized, though she had never had much interaction with her. Her expression was tense, her face flushed with urgency. But there was something in her eyes, something calculating, as if she had been waiting for this very moment to arrive. Without a word, the director strode into the room, completely ignoring Carla. Her eyes flicked over to Dr. Hughes, who stood frozen, and then to Mr. Williams, before landing on the woman in the lab coat. A strange, silent exchange passed between the two, as if they were communicating without ever speaking. Carla could hardly believe her eyes. The director, someone she had always trusted, was a part of this too. She was in on whatever game was being played here. And just like that, Carla realized the horrifying truth. She was surrounded by people who had all been playing roles, deceiving her, using her. The director turned to Carla, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of pity and something darker. "I'm sorry, nurse," she said, her voice smooth, but laced with an undercurrent of coldness. "But you've become a liability. You should have stayed out of this." Before Carla could react, she felt a sharp pressure on her arm. She looked down to see the man in the suit gripping her wrist, his fingers tightening painfully. The tension in the room escalated, the stakes suddenly much higher. They had her. And now Carla understood just how deep the conspiracy went. "You don't have to do this," Carla said, her voice cracking. But the woman in the lab coat only smiled, stepping closer. "Oh, we do," she said softly, almost kindly. "You see, nurse, the truth is that you were never meant to be a part of this world. But you've been brought into it, whether you like it or not. And now the game is over. There's no way out for you." Carla felt the world closing in around her. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had believed about her life and her career, was collapsing in on itself. She wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a part of something far darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But then, as the pressure on her arm increased, a sudden flash of movement caught her eye. It was Mr. Williams, his hand reaching out toward her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite read. For a moment, it looked like he might be trying to help her. But then, with a single decisive motion, he turned away from her, his back to her, as if to signal that he, too, had chosen his side. The final twist hit Carla like a slap to the face. The man in the suit, the woman in the lab coat, even the hospital director, they were all in it together. But the most shocking revelation of all was that Mr. Williams, the very man who had seemed like a victim in this twisted game, was the mastermind. And now, with all the pieces finally in place, Carla was left with a single horrifying truth. There was no escape. Not for her, and certainly not for anyone who had become entangled in this web of power and lies. Carla stood frozen, her mind struggling to process everything that had just unfolded. The world around her seemed to collapse in slow motion, as if each breath she took only amplified the weight of her realization. Mr. Williams, the man who she thought was a mere patient, was at the very center of a complex web of manipulation and power. And now, with no way out, she felt as though her fate had already been sealed. But even as the man in the suit tightened his grip on her wrist, something inside Carla sparked. A glimmer of resistance flickered within her, and she took a deep breath, focusing on the situation at hand. She had been pushed to the brink, but she wasn't going to let them control her completely, not without a fight. The woman in the lab coat had taken a step back, her smug expression only growing more pronounced as she watched the scene unfold. The director of the hospital, however, remained eerily calm, standing near the door as if she had anticipated this moment all along. Every person in the room seemed like a player in a game she no longer understood. But Carla knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to be their pawn any longer. "Why?" Carla asked, her voice trembling but fierce. "Why go to all this trouble? What do you all gain from this?" The man in the suit scoffed, his grip loosening slightly. "You still don't understand, do you?" His voice was a mix of pity and amusement. "It's not about personal gain. It's about control. We control everything, every hospital, every treatment, every decision made in this city. It's a game of influence, and we've been playing it for years." The director stepped forward, her cold eyes never leaving Carla's face. "It's about power, nurse. The kind of power that shapes the world without anyone ever knowing who's pulling the strings. People like Mr. Williams don't just have information. They have connections, resources that can make or break entire institutions." Carla's head spun as she tried to make sense of it all. The people around her, Dr. Hughes, the woman in the lab coat, even the hospital director, had all been part of this dark network. And Mr. Williams, the man who had been nothing more than a patient to her, had been the key all along. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how deep the corruption went. This was no ordinary medical scandal. It was something much bigger, something that reached beyond the walls of the hospital. But even as the pieces fell into place, Carla knew that she had to find a way out. She couldn't let herself be consumed by this dangerous game. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pulled away from the man in the suit, breaking free from his grasp. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she couldn't stay trapped in this room with these people for one more second. "I won't be part of this," she said, her voice stronger now. "You think you can control everything, but I'm not going to let you win." The woman in the lab coat chuckled, as if Carla's defiance was nothing more than an amusing distraction. "You've already been part of this, nurse. You just didn't know it." Her tone was filled with disdain, but there was an edge to it now, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Carla's eyes flicked to Mr. Williams, who had yet to move, his expression unreadable. He hadn't tried to stop the man in the suit from grabbing her, nor had he attempted to intervene in any way. But something about his demeanor shifted when he caught her gaze. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something like regret in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold indifference. "Don't make the mistake of thinking you can walk away from this," Mr. Williams said, his voice low and controlled. "You're already in deeper than you realize. There's no leaving now." Carla took a step back, her mind racing for a solution. She wasn't sure how she could expose everything that had happened in this room, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let them continue their dangerous game. She had to find a way to bring it all crashing down before anyone else got hurt. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed through the tense silence. Carla's eyes darted to the door, a flicker of hope rising in her chest. It was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to escape. The director frowned, her expression turning colder as she glanced at the door. "Who is it?" she demanded, her voice tight with irritation. The answer came quickly, and the door swung open to reveal a nurse from the lower floors, her face pale with panic. "There's been a situation," she said breathlessly. "The police, they're here. They're asking about Dr. Hughes, about Mr. Williams. They're starting to make connections." The room went dead silent. Carla's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had everything they had worked so hard to cover up finally come to light? She dared not believe it, but the flicker of hope in her chest burned brighter. The police were here. The game was over. The director's face twisted in fury, and she shot a glance toward Mr. Williams. "We need to move," she said urgently. "Now." But Mr. Williams didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Carla, as if he were evaluating her every reaction. "Let them come," he said softly, almost too calmly. "They won't find what they're looking for. Not yet." Carla's mind was racing. The police were here, but they wouldn't have enough evidence. Not yet. Everything was still too well hidden, too carefully orchestrated. The truth wouldn't come out so easily, not with these people pulling the strings. But that didn't mean it was over. She had to keep pushing. "I won't let you get away with this," Carla said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'll make sure the truth gets out, no matter what it takes." For a moment, there was silence. Then the director's eyes flicked to the woman in the lab coat. They exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible look, and Carla's heart sank. She knew they weren't going to let her get away. But then, just as quickly as it had all started, things began to unravel. The police officers who had arrived were no ordinary investigators. They had been waiting for this moment. Through a series of careful maneuvers and covert actions, they had gathered enough evidence to expose the corruption within the hospital and its far-reaching connections. They knew everything. And just as Mr. Williams thought he was in control, the officers stepped in and took charge, sweeping in like a wave that couldn't be stopped. As they arrested Dr. Hughes, the woman in the lab coat, and even the hospital director, Carla watched in stunned silence. The game had finally come to an end. But even as the authorities took them away, Carla felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. She had won, but at what cost? The truth had come to light, but it had revealed a world of corruption she couldn't have imagined. She had uncovered a dangerous conspiracy, but she wasn't the same person who had walked into that hospital just days ago. As the dust settled, Carla couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led her here. She had come to the hospital to heal, to help. Instead, she had been forced to confront a web of lies and manipulation that threatened to destroy everything. But through it all, she had found the strength to fight back, to uncover the truth, and to stand up for what was right. And as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, Carla knew that, for better or worse, her life would never be the same again. The game was over. But the scars left behind would remain, a constant reminder of just how deep the darkness could run, and of the strength it took to bring it into the light.